Let us go to Amsterdam, July 27th, 1656. The sun is setting over the Jewish quarter of the city, but a palpable tension reigns in the air. Inside the great synagogue, an assembly of rabbis is about to pronounce the most severe sentence of Jewish law, the herem, total excommunication. The condemned man is a young 23-year-old named Baruch Spinoza. But what is he accused of? Well, he dared to question the very foundations of religion and traditional philosophy. That day, Spinoza loses his community, his family, his inheritance. But what he gains in return is going to change the course of the history of thought. Because Baruch Spinoza, born in 1632 and died in 1677, is destined to become one of the most audacious and influential philosophers in history. In a century marked by religious wars, the Inquisition, and the persecution of free thinkers, Spinoza had the courage to propose a radically new vision of God, of nature, and of the place of man in the universe. His philosophy, both profound and provocative, would shake the foundations of Western thought and open the path toward modernity. But to understand how this young man came to challenge everything his world believed in, we must go back to the beginning. On November 24, 1632, Baruch Spinoza is born in the Jewish quarter of Amsterdam. His parents, Michael de Spinoza and Anna de Borja, are Portuguese Jewish merchants who fled the Inquisition a few years earlier to find refuge in the Netherlands. The Amsterdam of the 17th century is a fascinating city in full economic and intellectual ferment. It is the golden age of the Netherlands, a period of unprecedented prosperity. The city is a global commercial crossroads, attracting merchants and thinkers from all over Europe. This cultural and religious diversity turns Amsterdam into a melting pot of new ideas. So young Baruch grows up in an intellectually stimulating atmosphere, at the intersection of several worlds. On one side there is the Jewish community, deeply rooted in its traditions. On the other side there is the intellectual ferment of the city, where new ideas of the Renaissance and the beginnings of the scientific revolution circulate. At the age of 5, in 1637, Spinoza begins his education at the Jewish school. There he receives a traditional training, immersing himself in the study of the Torah, the Talmud, and rabbinic commentaries. He learns Hebrew, Aramaic, and later Portuguese, the language of his parents. But the awakened and curious mind of young Baruch is not content with conventional explanations. From a very young age he asks uncomfortable questions, challenging traditional interpretations of sacred texts. In 1638, when Spinoza is only 6 years old, Galileo Galilei publishes his discourses and mathematical demonstrations on 2 new sciences. Although young Baruch is too young to know about it at that moment, this publication marks the beginning of a scientific revolution that will have a profound impact on his future thinking. In 1641, René Descartes publishes his Metaphysical Meditations. This work, which will become a pillar of modern philosophy, will profoundly influence Spinoza, although he will end up distancing himself in a radical way. The life of young Spinoza is not free from tragedies. In 1640, when he is only 8 years old, he loses his mother. His father remarries but dies in turn in 1654, leaving Baruch, then 22 years old, in charge of the family business. Despite these trials, Spinoza continues his education with remarkable determination. Starting from 1645, Spinoza begins to explore the writings of classical philosophers. He reads Plato and Aristotle, but also medieval Jewish thinkers like Maimonides and Ibn Ezra. Around 1650, when he is 18 years old, Spinoza begins to take a serious interest in modern philosophy. He discovers the works of Descartes, but also those of Thomas Hobbes and Francis Bacon. These readings considerably broaden his intellectual horizons and lead him to question many aspects of traditional thought. Between 1652 and 1656, Spinoza develops his own philosophical ideas. He begins to formulate a vision of the world that departs radically from Jewish and Christian orthodoxy. He questions the idea of a personal and transcendent God, the immortality of the soul, and free will. These audacious ideas do not go unnoticed. Already in 1655, rumors begin to circulate in the Jewish community of Amsterdam about the heretical opinions of young Spinoza. The rabbinic authorities try to bring him back to the right path, even offering him an annual pension if he agrees to conform to orthodoxy. But Spinoza refuses to renounce his convictions. On July 27, 1656, he is excommunicated from the Jewish community of Amsterdam. The text of the Herem is particularly severe, prohibiting any Jew from having the slightest contact with him, reading his writings, or even approaching within 4 cubits of his person. The excommunication of 1656 marks a decisive change in the life of Spinoza. At 23 years old, he finds himself separated from his community, from his family, from everything that had constituted his world until then. It is at that moment that he abandons his Hebrew name Baruch for its Latin equivalent Benedictus. This change of name symbolizes his rupture with tradition and his entry into a new phase of his intellectual life. Forced to leave Amsterdam, Spinoza first settles in Ouderkerk and Amstel, a village near the capital. It is a difficult time for the young philosopher. The family business that he inherited after the death of his father is in trouble. It is at this moment that Spinoza learns the trade of lens grinder. This choice is not accidental. Lenses are essential for the manufacture of microscopes and telescopes, crucial instruments for the scientific revolution in progress. By choosing this trade, Spinoza places himself at the heart of the technological advances of his time. The grinding of lenses is not just a livelihood for Spinoza. It is also an activity that allows him to continue with his philosophical reflections. The repetitive manual work leaves his mind free to wander, to explore new ideas. In 1660, Spinoza settles in Rheinsberg near Leiden. It is in this small town where he will truly begin to elaborate his philosophical system. He remains there until 1663, a crucial period for the development of his thinking. The years from 1660 to 1670 are a period of intense intellectual activity for Spinoza. It is during this decade that he elaborates the foundations of his revolutionary philosophical system. In 1661, Spinoza begins to write his short treatise on God, man, and happiness. Although this work is not published until after his death, it already contains the seeds of his mature thinking. In it we find in particular the idea that God and nature are one and the same thing, a concept that will be at the center of his philosophy. In 1663, Spinoza publishes his first book, The Principles of the Philosophy of Descartes. It is the only book published under his name during his lifetime. Although this book is primarily an exposition of Cartesian philosophy, we already find in it hints of his own thinking. Notably, Spinoza subtly criticizes Cartesian dualism, the idea that the mind and the body are two distinct substances. It is also during this period that Spinoza begins to work on his magnum opus, the Ethics. The work will only be published posthumously, as the major part of its content was elaborated between 1661 and 1675. In 1665, Spinoza settles in Voorburg, near The Hague. It is there where he writes his theological, political treatise, published anonymously in 1670. This audacious book is a plea in favor of freedom of thought and expression. Spinoza develops a rational critique of the Bible and argues that religion should not interfere with politics. The publication of the theological political treatise provokes a scandal. The book is immediately condemned as a book forged in hell and prohibited in many countries. Despite the controversy, or perhaps because of it, the book circulates widely and has a considerable influence on European intellectual life. In 1673, Spinoza receives an offer to become a professor of philosophy at the University of Heidelberg. It is a prestigious position that would offer him financial security and intellectual recognition. However, Spinoza declines the offer. He fears that accepting an official position would limit his freedom of thought and expression. He prefers to remain independent, even if it means living in modest conditions. Now, let us dive into the heart of the revolutionary philosophy of Spinoza. His most audacious and controversial idea is what he called Deus sive natura, God or nature. For Spinoza, God and nature are not two separate entities. They are one and the same thing. This idea was absolutely shocking for his time, and it remains provocative even today. To understand this concept, we must abandon the traditional idea of God as a personal being, a kind of superhuman who creates the world, intervenes in human affairs, and judges our actions. For Spinoza, God is not a who, but a what. God is the totality of everything that exists. The universe itself, with all its laws and properties. God is not outside of nature, looking down on creation. God is nature, and nature is God. Every tree, every stone, every person, every star is a mode or expression of this infinite divine substance. This vision eliminates the separation between the sacred and the profane, between the spiritual and the material. Everything is equally divine because everything is part of God or nature. This does not mean that Spinoza was an atheist, as many of his contemporaries accused him of being. He believed in God, but his God was very different from the God of traditional religion. His God does not have desires, does not get angry, does not love or hate, does not reward or punish. His God simply is, existing with absolute necessity. This conception had profound implications. If God and nature are the same, then everything that happens in nature happens according to divine necessity. There is no room for miracles, for divine interventions that suspend the laws of nature. Everything follows from the nature of God, with the same necessity that the properties of a triangle follow from its definition. This vision was deeply troubling for religious authorities because it seemed to eliminate the need for organized religion, for priests and rituals, for prayers and sacrifices. Spinoza spent nearly 15 years elaborating his masterpiece, The Ethics. This work is unique in the history of philosophy because of its method and structure. Spinoza wrote it in the geometric manner, following the model of Euclid's geometry. He begins with definitions and axioms, then deduces propositions and demonstrations from them. This method might seem dry and abstract, but for Spinoza it was the only way to arrive at absolute certainty in philosophical matters. The Ethics is divided into 5 parts, each dealing with a fundamental aspect of his philosophy. The first part, titled Of God, was written between 1661 and 1665. In this part, Spinoza establishes the foundations of his system. He demonstrates, or at least attempts to demonstrate with geometric rigor, that there exists only one substance, which he calls God or nature. This unique substance has an infinity of attributes, of which we humans can know only 2, thought and extension, that is, mind and matter. Everything else that exists, including ourselves, are not independent substances, but modes or modifications of this unique divine substance. The second part, titled Of the Nature and Origin of the Mind, was written between 1665 and 1670. Here Spinoza tackles one of the most difficult problems in philosophy, the relationship between mind and body. Since Descartes, most philosophers had accepted a dualism, a radical separation between the mental and the physical. But this dualism created a seemingly insoluble problem. How can the mind, which is not physical, interact with the body, which is physical? How can a mental decision cause a physical movement? Spinoza solves this problem in a radical way. For him, mind and body are not two different things that interact. They are two aspects of the same thing, two ways of conceiving the same reality. The mind is not in the body like a pilot in a ship. The mind is the idea of the body. Every physical state has a corresponding mental state, not because one causes the other, but because they are two expressions of the same underlying reality. This vision, called parallelism, was revolutionary and remains influential in contemporary philosophy of mind. The third part of the Ethics, titled Of the Origin and Nature of the Affects, was written between 1670 and 1672. Here, Spinoza develops his theory of emotions. Unlike many philosophers before him, who saw emotions as obstacles to reason, Spinoza approaches them as natural phenomena that must be understood scientifically. He analyzes emotions with the same rigor that a scientist would study physical phenomena. For Spinoza, all emotions derive from three primary affects: joy, sadness, and desire. Joy is the passage from a lesser perfection to a greater perfection. Sadness is the passage from a greater perfection to a lesser perfection. Desire is the essence of man, insofar as it is conceived as determined to do something by any affection. All other emotions, such as love, hate, hope, fear, pride, and shame, are combinations or variations of these three primary affects. This approach to emotions was revolutionary because it treated them not as moral failings, but as natural facts that could be understood and explained. The fourth part, titled Of Human Bondage or the Strength of the Emotions, was written between 1672 and 1673. In this part, Spinoza explains how we are enslaved by our emotions when we do not understand them. We are passive when we are determined by external causes that we do not comprehend. We become active when we understand the causes that determine us. Here, Spinoza also develops his ethics, which is very different from traditional morality. For Spinoza, good and evil are not absolute categories decreed by God or discovered by reason. They are relative to our nature and our circumstances. What we call good is that which increases our power of acting, and bad is that which diminishes it. This relativistic conception of morality was extremely audacious for his time. It suggested that morality is not about obeying divine commandments, but about understanding what truly benefits us and increases our capacity to live and flourish. The fifth part of the Ethics, titled Of the Power of the Understanding or of Human Freedom, was written between 1673 and 1675. This final part is the culmination of the Ethics. Spinoza explains how we can achieve freedom and happiness through knowledge. For Spinoza, freedom does not consist in escaping from necessity, but in understanding and accepting it. The more we understand the causes that determine our actions, the more free we are. This conception of freedom is paradoxical. It is by understanding that we are determined that we become free. The summit of this freedom is what Spinoza calls the amor intellectualis Dei, the intellectual love of God. It is an intuitive understanding of our place in the universe and our unity with God or nature. This understanding comes accompanied by a supreme joy that Spinoza calls beatitude. It is not the joy of satisfying our desires, but the joy of understanding our true nature and our connection to the whole of reality. This intellectual love of God is eternal because it is based on eternal truths, not on fleeting circumstances. One of the most provocative ideas of Spinoza is his conception of freedom. Contrary to common belief, Spinoza affirms that free will is an illusion. Everything that happens in the universe is, according to him, the necessary result of prior causes. This idea might seem to lead to a despairing determinism. If everything is determined, what place remains for human freedom? But Spinoza, on the contrary, sees in this the path toward true freedom. For him, freedom does not consist in escaping from necessity, but in understanding and accepting it. The more we understand the causes that determine our actions, the more free we are. It is a bit like a swimmer who, instead of fighting against the current, learns to understand and use its movements. This conception of freedom has profound implications. It suggests that our sense of guilt or moral merit is largely illusory. We are no more responsible for our good actions than for our bad ones. What matters is understanding the causes of our actions so that we can modify them. Unlike many earlier philosophers, Spinoza does not see passions as enemies to be fought. He considers them as natural phenomena that must be understood rather than condemned. In the third part of the Ethics, Spinoza develops a sophisticated theory of the affects, or emotions. He shows how our emotions arise from our often inadequate understanding of the world around us. For example, fear is nothing more than a sadness born from the idea of a future evil, of which we are not certain. Hope, on the contrary, is a joy born from the idea of a future good, of which we are not certain. These definitions show how our emotions are linked to our ideas and our understanding of the world. An emotion is not just a feeling that happens to us, it is always connected to a thought, to an idea about what is happening or what might happen. For Spinoza, the path toward happiness does not pass through the suppression of passions, but through their rational understanding. The more we understand our emotions, the more we can master them and transform them into a positive force. When we understand why we feel what we feel, when we trace our emotions back to their real causes, we gain power over them. They no longer control us. We control them, or rather, we become active participants in our emotional life instead of passive victims. This approach to emotions was revolutionary for his time. It anticipated many discoveries of modern psychology, in particular the idea that our emotions are influenced by our cognitions. Today, cognitive behavioral therapy and other modern therapeutic approaches are based on principles remarkably similar to those that Spinoza proposed more than 3 centuries ago. The idea that changing our thoughts can change our emotions, that understanding the causes of our feelings can free us from their grip, is now widely accepted in psychology. But Spinoza was among the first to articulate this insight with such clarity and rigor. Although primarily known for his metaphysics and ethics, Spinoza also developed innovative political ideas. In his theological political treatise, published anonymously in 1670, he advocates for freedom of thought and expression. For Spinoza, the freedom to philosophize is essential not only for the progress of knowledge, but also for the stability of the state. He argues that the repression of ideas only makes them more attractive and potentially dangerous. When a government tries to suppress certain thoughts or beliefs, it does not eliminate them. It drives them underground where they fester and grow stronger. People become more attached to forbidden ideas precisely because they are forbidden. Spinoza believed that open debate and free exchange of ideas were far more effective than censorship in arriving at truth and maintaining social peace. A society that allows people to think and speak freely is a stronger and more stable society than one that rules through fear and repression. Spinoza defends a form of democracy where the state would guarantee freedom of thought and expression. He maintains that the objective of the state is not to dominate men, but to allow them to freely develop their reason. The purpose of government is not to transform people into obedient subjects or to control every aspect of their lives. The purpose of government is to create conditions under which people can live safely, pursue their own interests, and develop their rational capacities. These ideas were revolutionary for his time. They anticipated many aspects of modern liberal democracies, in particular the importance of the separation of church and state and the protection of freedom of expression. In the 17th century, most European countries had official state religions and severely punished religious dissent. The idea that the government should remain neutral on religious questions and allow people to believe and express what they wished was radical and dangerous. Yet Spinoza argued for exactly this, not out of indifference to truth, but out of a deep conviction that truth flourishes best in an atmosphere of freedom and open inquiry. The last years of the life of Spinoza are marked by intense intellectual activity despite increasingly fragile health. In 1675, he completes the Ethics, but decides not to publish it during his lifetime, fearing reprisals. He has already experienced the consequences of publishing controversial ideas with the scandal surrounding his theological political treatise. He knows that the Ethics, with its radical reconception of God and its challenge to free will, would provoke even greater outrage, so he keeps the manuscript private, sharing it only with a small circle of trusted friends and correspondents. In 1676, Spinoza receives a visit from Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, another giant of philosophy. Although their ideas differ on many points, this encounter demonstrates the growing influence of Spinoza in European intellectual circles. Even those who disagreed with him recognized the power and originality of his thinking. Leibniz would later distance himself publicly from Spinoza's ideas, perhaps out of caution, but the meeting shows that Spinoza was taken seriously by the leading thinkers of his age. Spinoza dies on February 21, 1677, at the age of 44 years, probably due to a pulmonary condition aggravated by the inhalation of glass dust during his work as a lens grinder. The very profession that had given him independence and allowed him to pursue philosophy freely had also slowly poisoned his lungs. He leaves behind an unfinished work, the Political Treatise, which will be published posthumously along with the Ethics and other writings by his loyal friends. The ideas of Spinoza, too radical for his time, did not have immediate success. In fact, his Ethics, published after his death, was immediately prohibited by religious authorities. For decades, being called a Spinozist was a grave accusation used to discredit philosophers and thinkers. His books were banned, his ideas were condemned, and most people who engaged with his philosophy did so secretly or under pseudonyms. To be associated with Spinoza was to risk one's reputation and potentially one's freedom. However, the influence of Spinoza has not ceased to grow over time. His ideas profoundly marked the philosophy of the Enlightenment. Thinkers like Diderot and Voltaire recognized their debt to him, although they did not share all his conclusions. The Enlightenment's emphasis on reason, its critique of traditional religion, its defense of freedom of thought, all owed something to the groundwork laid by Spinoza. He had opened doors that others would walk through. In the 19th century, the rediscovery of Spinoza had a considerable impact on German philosophy. Thinkers like Hegel, Schelling, and Nietzsche were profoundly influenced by his thinking. Hegel famously said that to be a philosopher one must first be a Spinozist. Nietzsche admired Spinoza's courage in facing a universe without divine providence or ultimate moral meaning. For these German philosophers, Spinoza represented a kind of intellectual heroism, a willingness to follow reason wherever it led, regardless of the personal cost. The influence of Spinoza extends far beyond philosophy. In science, his vision of a universe governed by necessary laws has inspired numerous researchers. Einstein, for example, said that he was profoundly influenced by the conception of God of Spinoza. When Einstein spoke of God, he meant something very close to what Spinoza meant, not a personal deity, but the rational structure of the universe itself, the laws of nature that govern everything. In psychology, the approach of Spinoza to emotions has been a source of inspiration for many researchers and therapists. His conception of freedom as understanding of necessity resonates in certain modern therapeutic approaches. The idea that we gain control over our emotions by understanding them, that knowledge is power over our inner lives, is central to many contemporary forms of therapy. Spinoza, the 17th century lens grinder, anticipated insights that would only be fully developed centuries later. Baruch Spinoza, the modest lens grinder of Amsterdam, left an indelible mark on Western thought. His life, which extends from 1632 to 1677, spans a period of profound intellectual changes in Europe. His audacious vision of a unified universe, his revolutionary conception of God and nature, his nuanced understanding of human emotions, and his passionate defense of freedom of thought continue to inspire and provoke reflection. Spinoza reminds us that philosophy is not an abstract exercise disconnected from reality. It is a search for understanding that can transform our vision of the world and our way of living. Philosophy is not just about debating obscure concepts in academic settings. It is about finding wisdom, about learning how to live well, about understanding our place in the universe. Spinoza lived his philosophy. He sacrificed community, family, and wealth for the freedom to think and to pursue truth. He chose poverty and solitude over compromise and conformity. His life demonstrates that philosophical ideas have real consequences, that they matter not just in theory but in practice. The questions he asked about the nature of God, about human freedom, about the relationship between reason and emotion, about the proper role of government, are questions we still grapple with today. His answers may not always be our answers, but his willingness to think deeply and honestly about fundamental questions remains an example for anyone who seeks wisdom. As he writes in the Ethics, all things excellent are as difficult as they are rare. The path to understanding, to freedom, to genuine happiness is not easy. It requires courage, discipline, and honesty. But for those willing to undertake the journey, the rewards are immeasurable. Spinoza's life and work stand as a testament to the power of human reason and the possibility of finding peace and joy through understanding our true nature and our place in the infinite web of existence. By the way, I have the impression that the narrator forgot to talk about my sentimental life. I must confess that love, in its conventional romantic sense, never occupied a central place in my existence. Some historians mention a possible relationship with the daughter of my Latin teacher, Van den Enden, but I prefer to maintain the mystery about these personal matters. I chose never to marry, not out of contempt for human love, but because my search for understanding, for the intellectual love of God, what I call amor intellectualis Dei, occupied all my thoughts. Solitude was for me a faithful companion, allowing me to dedicate myself completely to my philosophy and to the search for truth. Some might see in this an austere life, but I found a form of fulfillment that few human relationships could have brought me. You see, when you understand that you are part of the infinite substance, when you grasp your connection to the totality of nature, when you experience that intellectual love of the eternal, the ordinary concerns of life take on a different perspective. I do not say this with pride or superiority. I simply followed where reason led me, and it led me to a kind of peace and joy that did not depend on external circumstances or the approval of others. My life was not without its hardships. Excommunication, poverty, illness, the constant threat of persecution, these were real challenges. But I never regretted my choices. I lived according to my principles. I said what I believed to be true, even when it cost me everything. And in the end, I found something that all the wealth and social acceptance in the world could not have given me: the freedom to think, to understand, and to live in accordance with reason and nature. So I invite you to think for yourself, to question received wisdom, to seek understanding rather than comfort, and to follow reason wherever it may lead. The path is difficult, yes, but as I said, all things excellent are as difficult as they are rare. The journey toward freedom and wisdom is worth every sacrifice.